Thank you very much, Stephanie, and good morning to everyone from Addis Ababa. Good afternoon to everyone in Singapore, and greetings to everyone who's following from around the world. It's a great pleasure for me to have this opportunity on behalf of Dr. Vera Songwe, the Under-Secretary General and Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, who unfortunately could not be with us, but has expressed her support for this very important event about connecting Africa with Asia and with Singapore at this time of great uncertainty globally. So Minister Alvin Tan, we're delighted also that you are with us to be able to share your perspectives based on your experience and also on your vision for the future and Singapore's vision for the future in the context also of potential cooperation with Africa. We are seeing, unfortunately, an increasingly fragmented world. This is due to the challenges associated with COVID-19, to climate change, and also the economic challenges that are associated with these issues. And in the face of this fragmentation, what do you see as the role for the Africa-Singapore Business Forum to be able to address these challenges?
Oh, thank you, JP. Thank you, Stephanie, for opening us. And a good morning, good afternoon, perhaps good evening to our friends from around the world. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's on day 2. But as Stephanie was showing the video about the many different achievements that we've already had, about 18 agreements, including the one that I recently signed with Cabo Verde, I think it really underscores the importance of the ABSF. I think it's really, really important that the Africa-Singapore Business Forum, the ASBF to be precise, is playing such an important role. And it was, if we take it back a couple years ago, because JP, you asked why it was significant. It was first mooted in 2009, simply because we wanted to ensure that both Africa and Singapore and the wider region around Singapore get to know each other and to raise familiarity between both regions. And I thought that was quite significant. Fast forward to now, 2021, even in the midst of a pandemic, we are still meeting, which is a great sign. And we're not just meeting, but we're also signing agreements. We are also making sure that we are still capturing mind share, both sides in both regions. I thought I would start then by sharing a little bit about some nuggets of information or facts. Because it's not just about Africa and Singapore, but when we look at the context of Africa, its entire continent, if we look at the context of Singapore, it's a small island. JP and I were just discussing about islands earlier on as in prep for this. But Singapore, in this regard, has been seen in the context of the broader ASEAN region and the broader Asian region. So let me put that into a little bit of a context for all of us to chew on. The first is that if you look at population sizes, ASEAN as a region has 10 member states, compared to Africa, 54 member states, 10, 54 size. Another aspect of size is here in ASEAN, we have about 661.5 million, to be precise, compared to about a 1.34 billion in Africa. So again, a measure of size. In terms of land size, we are quite archipelagic, many different islands, 4.5 million kilometers square, as opposed to the African continent, 30.37 million kilometers square. So these are the differences in size. But there are also many similarities between both our regions. The first similarity is both are very much so developing regions. We are still growing. There's a lot of headroom, as Senior Minister Tharman mentioned yesterday in his in conversation. We have a lot of growth opportunities. In fact, in business speak, the upside is significant. The upside is significant. We are also incredibly diverse. If you think about it, both regions have a diversity of race, religions, and cultures. In fact, we have in ASEAN 1,000 different languages and ethnic groups. In Africa, you have 2,000 different languages. So you look at the diversity, you look at the market size, you look at the population size. I think even in a very COVID-constrained world, even in, as JP mentioned, where globalization is taking a bit of a backseat, I think we can see the opportunity set that is present before us. In that manner, JP, if you don't mind, with putting that as a context, I thought it would be quite useful for us to discuss as a context the different headwinds that are facing both regions, and then also the different tailwinds that could help propel our regions. I think the headwinds JP had mentioned are quite, has already been said many, many times. One, we're facing, I mean, all of the nations in the world are facing in quite stark contrast is, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. It's hit Africa, it's hit Asia. We are not spared. The Delta variant has spread across now to over maybe 150 or so countries. You can't close up. You can't close up is a headwind, but within this headwind also, I think there are a few pockets of optimism. Singapore is playing our part. I think people are also helping one another across different regions. We are co-chairing with Switzerland, for example, the Friends of COVAX. We had the opportunity to also play our part to contribute some medical supplies to our friends in Africa, including in Rwanda, Kenya, and Ethiopia. And we are also learning. JP is a former Minister for Health and very, very much skilled and experienced in dealing with vaccinations and pandemics. So we are learning from the African experience in how you manage different pandemics right here in Asia as well. So that's one headwind. The second headwind is on anti-globalization. We've seen a little bit more protectionism. We've seen great power rivalry. We've seen more fragmentation. Hopefully we can get over it, but I think this headwind is pretty strong at the moment. The other one, so these are the headwinds, but the tailwinds are quite optimistic as well. We can draw some optimism. The first is on technology, which we will discuss later. It allows for regions and countries to leapfrog traditional infrastructure constraints. The second is on regionalism. And regionalism, you'll see it in the African Continent Free Trade Agreement, integrating of the 52 different countries, but then also the opportunity to look at ASEAN experience, to see how then we can regionalize and also liberalize beyond ASEAN. So that's one. And we see the different trade agreements that Singapore has signed also in Africa. We've had, for example, 10 bilateral investment treaties. I mentioned earlier on the Cabo Verde avoidance of double taxation agreement. We have 13 of these Singapore has signed in the region. Another tailwind is, you mentioned earlier on about youth, which a ministry that I help look after. And youth is also represented in the framework of entrepreneurship. And the African continent is a hotbed of entrepreneurship. I think many, many different ideas, very similar to what we see here in ASEAN and in Asia. So I think I would just end by saying two things. One is that to use Singapore, not just as an island, but as a gateway to the ASEAN region and to Asia. We have many different opportunities for companies. We're about 7 hours away to many of the different places in Asia. We have a lot of different companies that are situated in Asia, up to about 7,000 different companies are headquartered here, either regional HQ or some business offices. But we also see the opportunity for Singapore companies, Singapore enterprises to invest in Africa, which has a huge opportunity set. It's the world's second fastest growing region, just after Asia. But you also, by 2030, will have 1.1 billion working age population, which is the world's largest in the world. So the opportunity set is just incredible. And I think this Africa-Singapore Business Forum helps to bring both sides together to explore this opportunity set. So very much looking forward to discussing more in detail with you, JP.
Thank you so much, Minister. And I think, as you've pointed out, the challenges, the headwinds that emerge, bring with them huge opportunities.
Indeed.
The tailwinds, the opportunities to really use this crisis, never waste a crisis as an opportunity to do things better and to get more benefits for our populations. So perhaps building on the experience of Singapore and ASEAN, how do you see this increasing interconnectedness with the world being managed to best support economic and social growth in a continent like Africa?
Thank you, JP. I think this interconnectedness, as we had discussed, is incredibly important. We talked about the headwinds, and the headwinds where there's more fragmentation, there's more protectionism, a retreat from globalization. But I think the tailwinds can overcome the headwinds. I think there's more tailwinds than headwinds. Let me explain a little bit more. Interconnectedness is driven by a few things. One is it could be driven by governments, and governments then form some of these trade architecture from which businesses can thrive. Let me be quite specific. There are, for example, in Africa, you already have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Again, 54 countries. In ASEAN, we have 650 million population. We have an ASEAN Economic Community. We have ASEAN Free Trade Agreements with major partners. And we allow for ASEAN member states, the 10, to also sign free trade agreements outside of ASEAN. So while we integrate and we regionalize and we consolidate, we are also keeping an open mind. So for example, some of the ASEAN member states are signatories to the CPTPP as well as RCEP. So I think that is something both sides can take a leaf out of one another's books. How do you stay integrated, regional, but then also have a forward-leaning positioning? That's important. But that's just what governments do. So for example, like the avoidance of double taxation agreements, the bilateral investment treaties, those are just architectures which we put to help to lower the barriers for the trading of goods and services, increase certainty in terms of how to do business across borders. But ultimately, I think it's the businesses that can take advantage of all of these architecture. And they can take advantage because of one, I think, personally to me, a very important tailwind, and that is technology. And technology helps to facilitate interconnectedness. Technology helps to also lower the barriers, and technology also helps to connect people, not just within their continents, not just within their countries or intra-region, but also across regions. And I think if you look at some of the agreements that have been signed just prior to ASBF, I think those are quite good examples of how interconnectedness has allowed us to transcend the tyranny of distance, as it were.
Thank you so much. As you very rightly said, governments have to put in place this architecture, but then we need companies, we need businesses and individuals to take advantage of this architecture that has been established. We're also facing in this current situation, as you pointed out, pushback against globalization. And part of that is because globalization has been associated with divergence between those that are poor and those that are richer. And arguably, this has been accentuated in the context of COVID-19. And so how do we make best use of tools, the technological tools such as digital connectivity, and the opportunities that are created by these people-to-people linkages across distances to grow the pie more equitably for our peoples?
Thanks, JP. I'm glad you asked that. I think the pie is rapidly growing because of the spirit of entrepreneurship on both ends, and facilitated, as we already had discussed, through technology. But what through technology? If I may suggest, there are many aspects of technology. One specific aspect that we've seen is platforms. And platforms are being used now by entrepreneurs and businesses. I mean, we saw Proxtera earlier on. Proxtera is a joint jointly set up by the Monetary Authority of Singapore and IMDA, which is the Infocom Media Development Authority in Singapore. And it has this, is brought to Africa what you call an open global meta hub. It's effectively a platform. I think it's being used now in Rwanda, Kenya, and Ghana. And what it does is it then connects business platforms to help SMEs in ASEAN, in South Asia, in Africa, to then discover either international trading opportunities or financing opportunities. So that's an example of a Singapore company bringing a platform technology to Africa to allow for connectivity so that small and medium businesses, it's not just sufficient to bring a platform in, it has to be useful. And to have SMEs use that platform to get access to financing, to also look at trading opportunities, I think that's quite incredibly helpful. But on the other side, on your side, JP, where you also see how platform is working. You have two incredible companies. One is M-Pesa, and the other one is Tula. M-Pesa, I used to work in technology, and we were looking at ways in which to use platforms to do e-payments. And M-Pesa has done that quite remarkably. For example, you have M-Pesa was set up in 2007. By 2015, 80% of Kenyans have got mobile banking accounts or mobile money accounts. That has now accelerated, I think, across many of the customers within Africa because of the ability for platforms to allow, you don't need to put, for example, a physical ATM, an automated teller machine. It allows for a very highly connected population with smartphones to access banking and mobile inclusion quite quickly. This is something which in ASEAN, because we had been banked a little bit earlier, well, not all of ASEAN, we will still have to put, automatic tellers. But I think M-Pesa has shown, even for Tula has shown, that you can skip that one step because of these platform technologies to then get banked, to use mobile money, to use e-payments. And I think the experiences from both ASEAN, Asia, as well as Africa, I think there's plenty of learnings from both regions when it comes to platform technology.
Thank you so much. I think that technology is one of the main areas that we can look at in terms of addressing this divergence and this divide. And you, I think, pointed to the examples in Africa, which are very interesting, around developing financial inclusion. I'd be interested as a follow-up question on this, because you also have the portfolio for youth. How can we really mobilize these technologies and maximize the opportunities for young people to get involved as entrepreneurs? And you use the example of the Singaporean company that is also providing, for example, access to finance to SMEs in the context of ASEAN. And perhaps you could speak a little bit about your experiences as well in terms of empowering young people through digital technologies and how we can use this in the context of strengthening the trade partnership between Singapore and Africa and Asia.
Thank you, JP. So I wear multiple hats, and I just joined government about a year ago and wear multiple hats. The first is the trade and industry hat, and the second is the culture, community, and youth. So I think the youth hat is quite interesting because it allows me to also understand what is key, foremost on the minds of our youth. And also, in fact, in Singapore, we are rapidly aging, but we have, for example, youth who are incredibly highly motivated in terms of starting up new initiatives, both on the economic front, business front, as well as a social front. If you look to zoom out of Singapore and you look at the region, in ASEAN, about 661 million compared to the African continent, I think what you see is that I think broadly a significant chunk of ASEAN have a young population, particularly in the region of Indonesia, Vietnam, and to a certain degree also the Philippines. Africa has that demographic dividend as well, young population. And when I worked across ASEAN, using Singapore as a launchpad and as a base, spending every week in one ASEAN country. Well, this is before COVID. If you were to be in Vietnam or in the Philippines or in Jakarta in Indonesia, you will see a lot of young people, because of what we spoke about, JP, that the platform effect is effectively over the top, OTT. Countries, governments can set the infrastructure for 3G, 4G, next is 5G. And then what these young entrepreneurs will do is that they will use platforms like, for example, I used to work at Facebook, which I think has a couple of billion users all over the world, significant number of users in Africa. But when I was trying to work on some of the products, one of the products that we used was Instagram, for example, very, very popular amongst the youth. And the youth were telling us while we were designing the product, they were already using Instagram to sell. They were already using Instagram to sell their batik. They were using Instagram for social causes. They were using Instagram to sell their coffee, fashion. So it's quite interesting. And then using the example, we say, okay, let's tweak the app a little bit so that they can use it better to create small and medium businesses. We've seen that also in the African continent because they are also using these platforms to then start to engage in marketing and e-commerce. So, and Instagram is just one aspect. There are many different platforms. M-Pesa as others, as another platform where you use that architecture. You don't yet know what you can use it for, but quite inevitably, the youth will just tweak it, use it for a purpose that it wasn't originally designed for, but then change the design principles of that particular app to suit that particular use case. And we've seen that proliferate quite a lot, both in the ASEAN region, but I also see that also in the African continent as well. So it bodes very well. And also they are also building their own platforms as well. Many have succeeded, some have failed, but when you fail and you develop the app and you fail, it helps you to develop a newer app, or you help you to refresh and you test the product in market. So very optimistic on that front.
Absolutely, and I think there's some very interesting experiences emerging from Africa in the context of the pandemic, where more and more
Indeed.
Young people are going online to sell products and services using Instagram, using Facebook, exactly as you've mentioned. And I think the experience that we've seen in ASEAN and in Singapore can be very interesting in terms of further building this capacity for financial inclusion in Africa. The framework already exists in a sense through these social media networks. And even though the technical infrastructure in Africa may be limited, the connectivity to mobile platforms is very high. And this presents a huge opportunity, I think, for businesses on both sides. So we very much look forward to develop that. I'd like to link this now perhaps to the African Continental Free Trade Area and get your thoughts on what are the opportunities, what does the AFCFTA bring to the table, the African Continental Free Trade Area? What does it bring to the table in terms of facilitating bilateral investment, facilitating free trade agreements? What does it provide for businesses? And what does it provide as well in this context of the digital economy that we've touched on?
Thanks, JP. Well, free trade agreements are something which Singapore has quite a bit of experience on. And it's simply because we are compelled by our size. So we have to get out of that size constraints. We have, I think, now about 26 free trade agreements signed globally. It's just a function that we can't trade amongst ourselves. We have to trade with partners. And I think that's one of the impetus in this forum as well. The African Continent Free Trade Area, I think presents an incredible opportunity because there are 54 members. I mentioned it's 5 times more than the size of the member states in ASEAN. But what it does is a couple of things. Number one, it helps to regionalize the area. So it's something which we've also seen that happen in ASEAN with the regionalization of ASEAN. Number two, it helps to then facilitate the transfer, the sale, the trading of goods and services, lowering trade barriers, lowering non-tariff barriers, for example, regularizing regulations so that they don't form an impediment. But when you also start to trade and you try to do business across, you also want to have less paperwork. And I think having a free trade area like that helps to lower the barriers of entry, helps lower the costs. And it applies both to MNCs as well as to small and medium enterprises, SMEs. And I think that allows, because ultimately free trade areas, free trade agreements are just agreements. Coming back to the first principles, they have no use case if they don't benefit a small and medium business or MNC. And I think the free trade area, the African Continental Free Trade Area, does exactly that. But if I may just push the envelope a little bit, while it also helps to, maybe reduce tariff elimination, reduce non-tariff barriers, align standards, I think it's what's quite important is that it's also important for the free trade area, perhaps to see whether there is opportunity to connect with other regions. Because then it opens up a whole plethora of opportunity sets. The experience that we've learned in Singapore, as I mentioned, the 26 free trade agreements, and then we've learned, if you zoom up again, you learn in what we've learned in ASEAN, for example, is that it benefits ASEAN member states if we step out of ASEAN as well. Because then we are also punching above our size. And I think if the African Continental Free Trade Area could also consider doing that, I think the opportunity set will be quite limitless.
Thank you very much. I think, and again, speaking from my perspective, my personal perspective as being from a small island, the Seychelles, and you've recently signed an agreement with Cabo Verde. I think there has to be that understanding that individual countries in a global trading environment are often isolated, but creating that framework for cooperation around regulation, creating that predictability, reducing the barriers, whether they be tariff or whether they be red tape or bureaucracy. Dealing with all of those issues creates a framework for cooperation and certainty for businesses. And I picked the point in particular that you said that this can be particularly empowering for small and medium enterprises. And that's what we really need to look at in terms of the linkages through these agreements. So I really appreciate those points. We'll now move the discussion. We've covered, we'll move the discussion on to a little bit the internal workings of supply chains. We've covered the connectivity aspects, and we'll now go into a little bit how we build those supply chains in the context of Africa, Singapore, and Asia, and how we address the supply chain resilience through diversification. So the first question I'd put to you in that context is, what do the challenges of this bifurcated world create for efforts to ensure supply chain resilience through the diversification of trade linkages?
Thank you, JP. I think the COVID-19 has been quite a sobering lesson for many of us. I remember in the early, it seems quite strange to say in the early days of the pandemic. I don't think we've seen very much the conclusion of the pandemic, but I do remember when we were trying to figure out countries as well as regions where to get masks. If you remember, US Vice President Kamala Harris is here this week. I think she's just left for Vietnam, again ASEAN, just about an hour or so ago. And I think she mentioned that this same point. She mentioned that in the early days of the pandemic, even the US were looking to see where to get face masks. They were looking to see where to get face masks. We were also looking to see where to get face masks in the very early days. And we also see supply chain now start to almost constrict in the early days of the pandemic. So it was sobering for us, it was sobering for many others. But I think what was important is that then you see the importance of them diversifying your supply chains, but also finding out what else you can also produce locally to trade. So right now, I think our supply chains are strengthened because we have all of these different partnerships that we've already built from a long time ago, but strengthened during the height of the pandemic, such that we are able to then also provide some assistance to our neighbors. So for example, some of our neighbors are also still battling the highs of the pandemic, like Indonesia. So we've sent across some oxygen concentrators across recently, because no one is safe until everyone is safe. Even for supply chains at the African region, we've also sent across some masks and some medical supplies to our friends in Africa. So we are able to then do two things. One is try to build the capability in-house, but also ensure that we can, number one, get critical supplies, be it masks or eggs or meat or water, but then also get critical supplies out to other regions as well. I think those are quite important. The other aspect that I wanted to share also, JP, if you don't mind, is we talked about digital earlier, but I also wanted to share that there are also digital supply chains, as it were. Let me explain. We signed recently a digital economy partnership agreement with Chile and New Zealand. And I think that's quite useful, because what this digital economy partnership agreements, or DEAs, do is then help to lower the barriers and help to recognize different e-payments, e-invoicing systems across different countries, because that is the new currency of commerce, e-commerce. And I think these digital economy agreements will help to facilitate these trades, digital goods, but also physical goods and services, for example.
Thank you so much. And I think the key point about resilience of supply chains is that there has to be a security for countries in knowing that even in the event of disruptive events such as COVID-19, that you're able to adapt quickly. In Africa, we did see some positives. We've seen some companies that have adapted by creating the capacity to manufacture face masks, also around some of the biomedical equipment. And there's also been the establishment of the African Medical Supplies Platform with the support of ECA, Afrexim Bank, African Development Bank, and other partners, which has created a framework that has facilitated this conversation and these exchanges through e-commerce to be able to trade these items and build a value chain within the continent. But these value chains in the continent will only be valuable as well if they are connected with global value chains. And I think this is really where the interest lies. And if I could have a follow-up question on the digital economy agreements, because I think that this will be a key factor in terms of empowering companies in Africa. And maybe you could expand a little bit on the experience that you've had in Singapore, and perhaps how this could translate into the African context.
Yeah, so I think trade has evolved. Trade has been much more dynamic, potentially also being catalyzed by COVID-19. So the traditional trade agreements are still very relevant. You've seen the bilateral investment treaties, you've seen DTAs, the one we've said many times with the Cabo Verde one, which underscored this forum. But there are also many others, FTAs, free trade areas. But what we're trying to do in Singapore and with our like-minded partners is to think about it a little bit in a more dynamic fashion and be innovative in terms of trading relationships. And that comes in the form of DEAs, the one that we signed with Chile and New Zealand, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. We are also looking at, I think, JP, this might be something of interest to you, green economy agreements as well. So green economy agreements that are focused on green financing, focused on research and development on low carbon technologies, clean tech, for example, and also regularizing, again, standards and frameworks for the deployment of hydrogen, for example. Singapore and ASEAN accounts for about 50% of green bonds and loans. Singapore accounts for 50% of bonds or green bonds and loans in the ASEAN region. We are also negotiating green economy agreements with our partners. It's just tweaking these conventional trade agreements, making it bite-sized, and then using them as building blocks that are purpose-fit for 2021. Back to the digital agreement, I thought what was quite useful for Africa, because Africa has such an incredible strength on fintech, e-payments, e-commerce, is to connect the financial connectivity between both our regions in terms of cross-border payments, in terms of trade finance and insurance. And I think using Singapore, with all of the different aspects, which, Tula and M-Pesa and others, using Singapore as a gateway towards ASEAN through fintech and through these digital economy agreements, I think it opens up yet another opportunity set as a platform for businesses to do and to trade their goods and services. So I think, thank you for asking that question. I thought it was quite an important point to make.
I'm delighted that you've raised the point about green economy agreements because one of the biggest challenges for African countries precisely is the channeling of investments into green sectors. So I think that this is something that should be a key part of the framework and will be certainly developed, I think, under the aegis of the African Union, which has recently adopted a green stimulus program, for example. And the leadership of Singapore in bond financing, I think particularly sustainable bonds, is going to be extremely interesting because Africa currently accounts for less than 1% of global green bond issuances. So I think there's a real opportunity and using the aspect of digital technology as well to create that synergy between using digital technologies for monitoring the flow of funds, for example, but ensuring that they go into meaningful sectors like renewable energy in Africa. So I think this is something that will require further exploration. I think in terms of the some follow-up questions which are related, one of the questions around the AFCFTA is how can government leaders encourage businesses to diversify supply chains with Africa and Singapore partners? And I think we can look at this through the sustainable lens, but also in the context of building those resilient supply chains, both in Singapore and in Asia and in Africa.
That's right. I think it just presents an incredible amount of opportunity, as we mentioned earlier on, to lower barriers to trade, lower or eliminate even tariffs, but also, if you have to be even more specific, allow for some of the key trading opportunities. The reason why I keep raising fintech is because I think that's a huge strength in Africa, for example. And it's not just the free trade area that is exciting, it is also the potential. What do you then do with the free trade area? And then how do you connect the African free trade area to ASEAN through Singapore? Fintech offers us a concrete an idea. We have this Afro-Asia Fintech Festival, and I think that's an opportunity for us to grow this fintech growth corridor through Singapore and Kenya towards ASEAN. And I hope that many of our other African community and other African counterparts within the African continent free trade area can consider using this growth corridor. Just simply because I think Africa has a strength in fintech, and the opportunity set for fintech is just increasing. It's something that ASEAN can learn, but also there's a lot of interchange because e-payments is huge in ASEAN. And you're basically banking the unbanked, financial inclusion. And going back to the first principle, which we started at the start of this conversation, JP, was just look at the numbers. 1.3 billion in Africa. It's just half of that in ASEAN, but combined, I think it's almost almost 2 billion people, and a significant amount working age significant amount young, demographic dividend, significant amount very tech savvy, digital first, using platforms to build businesses on top of one another. So I think the opportunity set again is huge, and I would just like to encourage both sets of businesses, both African businesses, to look to Singapore, to ASEAN, and for Singapore businesses. And we already have many good businesses from Singapore already invested in Africa. But I think we need to increase that mind share. But there are many different pathfinders across both regions. And I think if SMEs and other businesses who are keen to explore these different regions can latch on, learn from some of these companies. For example, Singapore companies like Tolaram, Olam, Wilmar, for example, Proxterra. When we speak to them, they're already very much interested and keen to bring in other partners, Singapore companies, even companies around ASEAN, to invest, hold their hand, invest into Africa, and then grow together. I think as what Senior Minister Tharman mentioned earlier today, the growth set in Africa is huge. You just have to be there, land, and seize the opportunity.
Thank you so much. And you've touched a little bit on some of the next question that I was going to come with, because you've mentioned that fintech in particular as one of the biggest opportunities for investment in Africa, in terms of the companies that are involved in fintech, but also about the way in that this will unlock other sectors of the economy. So I'd like you to perhaps share with me, and we're coming to the end, we have about 10 minutes. So perhaps you could share with me a few of the other key areas that are very interesting for potential partnerships between Africa and Singapore to build these resilient supply chains. And for example, around logistics, the use of technology in logistics, trade financing as well, because one of the biggest challenges as well in Africa, huge opportunities in agribusiness, but we also need the ability to finance that through trade finance and linking that with potential exports and therefore with partners in Singapore and Asia and beyond. So perhaps you could expand a little bit on some of those areas that you see as opportune for building these resilient supply chains.
Yeah, JP, I think you raised a really important point. And when we speak to businesses, I think one of the areas where there is room for growth and improvement is exactly that, is on trade financing. And I used to work in finance, and I know ultimately finance is all based upon trust. It's based on trust, and it's based upon whether you think that that particular business can grow. When you invest in that particular business, when you want to finance, when you want to effectively finance that business, you must have that confidence that that business can grow, can seize the opportunity set, and can maybe not dominate the market, but at least get a significant market share. I think, to be very candid, I don't think that is happening as quickly or as much as we would like to. So trade financing is a challenge, but I think you need pathfinders. You need pathfinders, and that's not just pathfinders who are then landing in Africa or in ASEAN, but then you need financial institutions, partners, to say, I'm going to back you. I think that is not happening in as much as we want, but if we are able to unlock that, and that takes a few things. I think one is what government has been doing in terms of the free trade agreements, lowering the barriers to entry through BITs, avoidance of double taxation and all that. Government can provide that infrastructure, government can provide that framework. But ultimately, it also requires businesses to go in, and then their financing partners to say, I'm going to back you. So coming from the private sector, I think private sector has that responsibility to do so. But then now moving into government, I know that government has the responsibility to make it easier for the private sector to say, I'm going to take that risk, I'm going to take that financing risk. But knowing that there is these trade architectures that are available, and let me just do a quick recap. You have the Africa Continent Free Trade Area, 54 countries. You have ASEAN Economic Community, 10 countries. you have potentially, 2 billion people in these two regions. You have a myriad, in Singapore, 13 BITs, 10 avoidance of double taxation agreements. We just saw, as Stephanie mentioned, 18 agreements or partnerships announced just before this forum. These are all foundations. We just then need to, we've already paved the road. I think people just need to look and take that step, go to Africa or come to Asia. The trade agreements are already there. Yeah.
Thank you. And you've really, I think, situated the importance of the pathfinders, the people that will take the first steps. And they will need support, the support from governments in terms of lowering barriers to entry, dealing with the regulatory aspects. And you also need financial institutions to make sure that they are accompanied and that this is channeled into the sectors that need it most. For example, in Africa, we've talked about the green sectors, which includes renewable energy. We talked a little bit about agribusiness, which is a huge opportunity. And I think you spoke particularly about the magic ingredient, which is trust. And certainly the AFCFTA can play a key part of building that trust. It's one of the key elements linking with the ASEAN agreements on the Asian side. And these are part of the elements of the trust. Perhaps the certainty of financing is one of the elements that needs to be strengthened based on what you said. So we end the final 5 minutes of our Fireside Chat. It's been an absolute delight to exchange with you, and we could go on for hours. I hope the audience is realizing that we could talk for a lot more than this. But since we're in the last 5 minutes, I would ask you, what is the one or two things that you see as really the key takeaways in terms of accelerating investments both ways? So in terms of getting investments from Singapore into Africa, and in terms of getting investments from, and in terms of facilitating the growth of trade within Africa, with the potential as well of increasing exports and increasing export investment from Africa. So what are the key accelerators, facilitators as your key takeaways? And we have 4 or 5 minutes to conclude on that.
Thanks, JP. I wanted to raise just an example of Tolaram. And in Asia, in many parts of Asia, we enjoy noodles. And growing up as a student, I used to, in my dorms, eat this, enjoy Indomie, which is basically instant noodles. It is now enjoyed by millions of Nigerians because Tolaram in the 1990s brought Indomie to Nigeria. And of course, the Nigerians, as opposed to obviously the ASEAN countries, people in ASEAN countries, are not very familiar with Indomie. So I think Tolaram had to also say, okay, you use it. This is how you cook the instant noodle. You first put water, you boil it. Don't boil it. Don't put too much water so it gets soft. And then you don't eat it with, it's better to eat it with a chopstick, for example. But Tolaram also faced infrastructure issues in the early days when they first set it up. So they set up, I think, a company called BHN Logistics. Now Tolaram and Indomie is a household name in Nigeria. They have a noodle production house for Indomie. They have joint ventures with Kellogg's and other organizations. They have now a diversified presence in Nigeria. And they're also now developing the Lagos FTA. I cite that as a closing example because you can, products that are, you think, unique to ASEAN or unique to Asia can succeed in Africa. Companies that you think might not succeed in Africa can succeed there. And they can do two things. They can increase factors of production or invest in production companies in Africa. They can also then help to develop and grow the African story, like the FTA in Lagos. So we can wax lyrical on free trade, we can wax lyrical on digital economy agreements, green economy agreements, fintech and everything. But I think ultimately, if you have that entrepreneurial spirit to go across either both ways, hopefully. I think that's quite critical. And I think what we can do and what the ASEAN Singapore Business Forum is doing today, and we are committed to do year after year, because Africa is so important to us in this region, is that to continue to make sure that in Singapore and in ASEAN and in Asia, Africa is on our minds. And we must always raise that profile of Africa to our businesses here, so that we can grow together. Again, the figures are indisputable. Almost 2 billion population and incredibly diverse, both in youth, both in language, both in culture. I think it's just a win-win. As one of our partners, one of the 18 partnerships, one of the companies is called Win-Win, by the way. So I think with that, I think I would just wrap up, and I hope that I wish you a very successful time also, and I wish all of our businesses on both sides, a win-win outcome from both regions.
Thank you so much, Minister Alvin Tan. It has been an absolute delight to have this conversation with you in this fireside chat. We've really talked about the areas in which we can build resilience, both in Africa and in Asia, through Singapore, through the Africa-Singapore Business Forum. Africa is on our minds, and we are aiming for win-win. Thank you so much. And with that, we conclude this fireside chat, and I'm delighted to go back to Stephanie for the next segment. Thank you very much, Minister Alvin Tan.
Thank you, JP.